Hello everyone. So I never imagined, to be honest, that I'd be delivering these last few sessions from my front room, but obviously all that's unfolded has meant that it's either this will potentially wait for a few months. So I sort of felt prompted by God to maybe have a go at recording this and sending it out to you all. So we've managed to get through Isaiah 1 to 39, and we've got 27 chapters left, and I've decided to divide these up into 3 sessions just to make the whole thing a bit more digestible. And I was trying to see if these chapters broke up into sort of smaller units, but I've sort of come to the conclusion that Isaiah 40 to 66 must represent one prophetic unit. There doesn't seem to be any clear sort of delineation between the chapters, which make me think that it might be broken up into smaller units. So based on that assumption, we're going to look at it as one prophetic unit, but in 3 sections over the next few weeks. We've sort of journeyed through these 3 prophetic cycles in the last few weeks, and what each prophetic cycle represents one of the Neo-Assyrian kings. So the first set of prophecies, which I called the temple prophecies, happened under the rule of Tiglath-Pileser III. And the second prophetic unit took place, I called them the naked prophecies, under the reign of Sargon II. And then the third set of prophecies took place under Sennacherib, and build to this amazing climax where Sennacherib's forces come and surround Jerusalem, and God in the end rescues his people. I've tried to put a date on these things, and I know it's a little bit debatable, but I've said that 707 represents the year that Sennacherib invaded the Levant, and I'm suggesting that this whole thing probably didn't end until 705. And when Sennacherib arrives, we've seen that it was quite a devastating thing, and I don't think we can underestimate how devastating this really was. The Neo-Assyrians were very aggressive and destructive, and they leveled towns, villages, and cities. And one of the cruel things that the Neo-Assyrians did, which we have historical evidence for, is that especially when a siege needed abandoning, what they would do, they would chop down all the fruit trees and destroy all the vineyards, and that, as a result, that would leave a country in economic ruin. So it was a pretty cruel thing that they did, and I think that's probably why this stump prophecy in Isaiah 6 that we've spoken quite a lot about, I think it's why it's so important and so significant, because the first desolation, this coming of Sennacherib, is described as a tree being cut down, and that's probably, to be honest, what happened. The Neo-Assyrians, when they'd failed to take Jerusalem, they probably devastated the land as they went back into the north. And back in Isaiah 32, Isaiah actually prophesies about this devastation. In a passage in Isaiah 32, verses 9 to 10, Isaiah says, "You women who are so complacent, rise up and listen to me. You daughters who feel secure, hear what I have to say. In little more than a year, you who feel secure will tremble. The grape harvest will fail, and the harvest of the fruit will not come." So by my calculation, if Sennacherib invaded in 707, this is talking about in little more than a year. So that this would place this particular prophetic moment that Isaiah is speaking about in 706. And it may be that 706 was the year that the Neo-Assyrians actually did abandon the siege of Jerusalem. There's a similar prophecy in Isaiah 37 when Isaiah speaks to Hezekiah, when he prophesies concerning Hezekiah's recovery. In verses 30 to 31, Isaiah says this, "This will be a sign for you, Hezekiah. This year you will eat what grows by itself, and the second year what springs from that. But in the third year, sow and reap, plant vineyards, and eat their fruit." It's a bit of a curious sort of sign to give Hezekiah, but if you imagine this was in the context of some sort of siege and some sort of devastation to the land, and that all their all their ability to produce food was completely destroyed by the Neo-Assyrians, the prophecy really makes sense, and it would have been an important comfort and encouragement to Hezekiah. And the word there in the Hebrew for sign we'll see it becomes quite an important word in the book of Isaiah. In fact, we've already come across it before. But the word there is ha'aut, and it's pointing to this famine, but also to the survival of the people living in Jerusalem, and it's also pointing to this year when there will be the restoration of fruitfulness, and that the Jerusalemites will be able to plant vineyards again and eat the fruit of the fruit trees. And so it sort of has a period of like 3 years locked into that prophecy. And I'm suggesting that perhaps this third year of harvest and fruitfulness that Isaiah is prophesying probably took place in 704, if my dates are right, after Sargon has gone back and Sargon has died and Sennacherib has returned to Assyria. And this image of like a coming year, a year of fruitfulness, it's a really important motif that emerges in the book of Isaiah. This idea that there will be a vineyard that will bear fruit again. And probably it links right back to Isaiah 5, where we read about God's desire to plant a fruit vine, a fruitful people. And we know from that passage and from the Old Testament in general that God's plan for his people has gone terribly wrong. They've ended up exiled, they've ended up devastated. And yet here we have this little glimpse that God's plan for his people to be a fruitful people has not completely failed. Way back in Isaiah 5 verse 7 it says, "The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel and the people of Judah, and the vines he delighted in. And he looked for justice, but he saw bloodshed, for righteousness, but he heard cries of distress." So this idea of God's people being like a vineyard, and it's a vineyard that didn't produce the fruit that God required, and it's a vineyard that's ultimately devastated. We begin to see this different image emerging whereby God still has the capacity to bring forth a fruitful people despite the devastation. And Isaiah 37:31 in particular really resonates with this vision. Once more a remnant of the kingdom of Judah will take root below and bear fruit above. So there's this sort of promise that one day this remnant, the survivors of this devastation, they will bear fruits. And that the whole scene is sort of prophetically charged, that the fruit of God's kingdom will come forth, that there will be this branch, this descendant of David, the branch of Yahweh, who will bear the fruit of the kingdom. But we're going to sort of turn the page on Isaiah 39 and those 3 prophetic cycles. And we're going to begin our engagement with a whole new prophetic period. And what I'm suggesting to you that this next section, Isaiah 40 to 66, it represents one sort of prophetic year in a sense. It's like the day of the Lord's favour, but also the year of the Lord's favour and the day of the vengeance of God. And I sort of feel like everything's been building up to this point where we've had devastation, but now there's going to be comfort and there's good news on the way. So looking at Isaiah 40 onwards, there's a few things to say about this. First of all, we don't actually know when these prophecies were written down. Unlike the other prophecies of Isaiah, there were some little clues, some historical markers which gave us an idea when they were recorded. But with these prophecies at the end of Isaiah, second Isaiah, we don't have any of those sort of strong prophetic markers or historical markers. We know that God told Isaiah he would prophesy until the end of the first desolation. But as I tried to point out at the very beginning of this course, he probably had a prophetic ministry before this prophetic commission, and he probably had a prophetic ministry after this prophetic commission. And in truth, they were probably written at some point after the events of 707 to 705, maybe 704, we don't know. We know that Isaiah probably did live until the reign of Manasseh, the son of Hezekiah. But we also, I mean, tradition has it that that Isaiah was actually executed by Manasseh, that he was actually sawn in two. And that wouldn't be a surprise in many ways, because Manasseh, for most of his reign, was a wicked king and probably wanted to get rid of Isaiah pretty quickly. So we don't know, that's the truth. We don't actually know when Isaiah prophesied these last series of prophecies. But what I want to call this last section, these last 27 chapters, I want to call them, I call them the aftermath prophecies. And I call them the aftermath prophecies because they come in the aftermath of the destruction of Judah and the near destruction of Jerusalem in 707. So that's what we're going to be looking at. They're the chapters that we're going to be engaging with in this session and beyond. And what's interesting, what's really fascinating, and you can look at this in your Bible, if you look at chapter 39 of Isaiah and you look at chapter 40 of Isaiah, you can tell that there's a shift in the way that things are written, but what you can't always tell necessarily is that there is this big prophetic gulf between chapter 39 and chapter 40. It's what I call a prophetic leap, which I've mentioned before. And the bit in between, the historical period in between Isaiah 39 and Isaiah 40, I call missing Isaiah. It's like there's this whole chunk of history missing. And what happened in this period is interesting, because what I'm suggesting is that Isaiah 40 was written nearly 150 years, or it was referring to a period nearly 150 years after Isaiah 39. And all throughout the first Isaiah, so the first 39 chapters, there's been this allusion to this coming destruction of Jerusalem. And we know that Jerusalem was nearly destroyed in 707, but there's an allusion to another destruction of Jerusalem. And normally that destruction is prophesied in terms of some sort of fire, the fires of destruction coming to Jerusalem. Isaiah 29 is a good example. The whole of Isaiah 9, if you look it up, is dedicated to this idea of Ariel, Jerusalem being called Ariel and being described as an altar hearth. Isaiah 6, we looked at that passage in detail. It talks about though a tenth remain in the land, it will be again laid waste. And in fact, the Hebrew for that term again laid waste really includes this idea of being burnt. And of course, that's what eventually happens. Jerusalem is destroyed by the Neo-Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar, and the city is pulled to the ground and everything is burnt. And the people of Israel, the people of Judah rather, are taken into captivity to Babylon. And there's a brilliant bit at the end of Isaiah 39 where Hezekiah welcomes the envoys of Babylon. This is way before any of this happens. And Isaiah prophesies to Hezekiah. It's his last sort of recorded, historically placed prophecy. He says, the time will surely come, it's verse 6 of Isaiah 39, the time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your predecessors have stored up to this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. And of course this is a reference to the exile, it's a reference to maybe Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. Of course Ezekiel was also taken into captivity, and Jeremiah was nearly taken into captivity. But this is what I'm suggesting, that in Isaiah 39, this second devastation, this second desolation is what is being referred to. And of course, if you remember when we looked at Isaiah 21, when I'm suggesting Isaiah was at the brook of Egypt, he has this terrible vision that seems to haunt him and trouble him as he goes back to Jerusalem. And also in Isaiah 3, the final destruction of Jerusalem is mentioned. Right back in verse 1 of chapter 3, see now the Lord Almighty is about to take from Jerusalem and Judah both supply and support. And there seems to be like this incredible reference to this besieging of Jerusalem during this time, and it goes on rather morbidly to say, instead of fragrance there will be a stench, instead of a sash, a rope, instead of well-dressed hair, baldness, instead of fine clothing, sackcloth, instead of beauty, branding. Your men will fall by the sword, your warriors in battle. The gates of Zion will lament and mourn, destitute she will sit on the ground. That's verses 24 to 26 of chapter 3. And it's really interesting that if you look closely at the language used in this chapter, the word there for rope, it says instead of a sash, a rope, is a word called nikpa, which is a rope that was used to encircle a captive. And similarly, the word there for branding, instead of beauty branding, ki is the Hebrew for branding there, and it was a practice used by the Babylonians to mark slaves, and maybe even involved the shaving of heads as well. So all through the early Isaiah, there's this sense of this immediate coming of the Assyrians, but also this further off destruction of Jerusalem that one day will happen, that will involve the burning of the city and the exile of its inhabitants. And as I've mentioned, Isaiah doesn't write about this at all. He doesn't write about this destruction. In fact, he's dead by then. But he does prophetically allude to it. And this is this historical gulf. This is all taking place in this historical gap between Isaiah 39 and Isaiah 40. And it's in that period that Jeremiah and Ezekiel both write. And in fact, Jeremiah himself witnesses these very events and is taken into captivity, or in fact he is on the way into captivity before he's set free. And this all unfolds in 586 BC. But Jerusalem is destroyed. Maybe you've got one question in your mind still as we move on to talk about the Babylonians and the coming of the Babylonians. Is what happened to the Neo-Assyrians, because we've spent a lot of time thinking about them and the terror that they brought to the whole region. And pretty much what happens to the Neo-Assyrians pretty much is what happens to most empires of the time, ancient empires, is that they became divided. They had a lot of internal factions. There was a weak succession. They're logistically overstretched. And in the end, the kingdom sort of collapsed in on itself. The empire collapses in on itself. And there's this group of people living in the north of what is modern day Iran called the Medes, that you've probably heard of, and who come and destroy the kingdom of, well, they actually destroy Nineveh in 614 BC. And of course the Babylonians at the same time are coming into power, and there's these two forces that are moving against the Assyrians. But this sack of Nineveh in 614 was really a big thing, a massive shock to the ancient world, because the Neo-Assyrians had ruled for hundreds of years. And of course Nineveh was the very city that Jonah prophesied against, and the city was spared, but by this point it is back again in the sights of God's judgment. And in fact, just out of interest, if you read the book of Nahum is dedicated to the fall of Nineveh. And after the fall of Nineveh, the empire gradually just disintegrates and leaves this power vacuum that the Medes from the north and the Babylonians begin to fill. So that's the backdrop in many ways to Isaiah 40. And what we're going to do, we're just going to have a look at the text of Isaiah 40. It's a very famous text, and although it feels like the words initially fit following the escape of Jerusalem in 707, in fact there is this big jump, and we've got lots of indicators that Isaiah is speaking about future events beyond the immediate historical context in which he was writing. And the chapter begins very famously with those words, comfort my people, says your God, speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, and that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. And this is how Isaiah 40 begins. This word, it's easy to misunderstand this passage. And the passage begins with these two words, comfort, same word, nahamu. And the idea really was that the time of mourning was over. And even this reference to she has received double for her sins, I believe references the two desolations, the first desolation of 707 and the second desolation of 586. And it says that her hard service has been completed. which is the Hebrew seva. And it's more literally reads, her warfare is over. And whilst it reads as a sort of promise of peace, in fact it's a sort of unconventional peace, possessed by a land and a city in ruins, and entering an enforced Sabbath. That's the image. That's the sort of what the chapter is trying to sort of evoke, this image of a land entering an enforced Sabbath that has suffered and that has been destroyed and is left to rest. That's the sort of words that are being spoken out by Isaiah over the land and over the city. This is really what happened. The 2 Chronicles speaks of this period of desolation after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. It refers to it as, in 2 Chronicles 36 verse 21, it says this: the land enjoyed its Sabbath rests all the time of its desolation. It rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. And so in the history of Judah and Jerusalem, there is this 70-year period where the land is just left to rest, to fulfill its Sabbaths. And it's a sort of majestic picture in a way, but also a dreadful picture. And we've got to be clear here, Isaiah is not painting a picture of a city, restored. He's painting a picture of a city in ruins. And he's speaking words of comfort to a city of ruins. And I mean, probably just so you have some sense of context, the Book of Lamentations is actually written completely dedicated to this destruction of Jerusalem, and sort of confirms this complete destruction and desertification of the city. And Lamentations 1 verse 1 says, "How deserted lies the city, once so full of people." So in short, Jerusalem at this point, and by Isaiah 40, it's in ruins. And we are somewhere, prophetically, we are somewhere in this 70-year period. Isaiah is prophesying into this 70-year period. And we can't work out the exact moment. But he is speaking to a people of the future. I call this like prophetic displacement. He's speaking to a people who have been exiled from their land, and taken to another land. And so he is trying, in Isaiah 40 to 66, he is trying to encourage this people of the future that this is not the end, that there is still a hope and there is still a future. And that's a theme we're going to come across over and over again. So it's in this context that the rest of Isaiah 40 begins to make sense. The language evokes desolation, emptiness, a voice of one calling in the wilderness, "Prepare the way for the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill laid low. The rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain, and the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all the people will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." So it's like in this desolation, in this destruction, in this place where people have been taken from their lands, that we get the sound of a voice, that a voice is crying out, a voice of one calling in the wilderness. And of course this is sort of prophetically is used to speak of John the Baptist, and quoted in all 4 Gospels as being John the Baptist. But let me just suggest to you that there's a lot more happening here than just this sort of future prophecy about the coming of the one who would point to the Messiah. In fact, the identity of this voice crying out is very mysterious. It's grammatically very awkward, the way that it's written, and it has a sort of Daniel or Revelation feel to it, where these voices just speak out of nowhere, and they're just heard. And Isaiah actually hears this voice twice. I don't know if you realise that, but he hears it again later in the same chapter. And the first voice, we're told, cries out, "Kol Kore," and the second voice says, it's probably the same voice, "Kol Omer," so this mysterious voice is speaking to Isaiah, or speaking out in the wilderness. And right back in verse 2 of Isaiah 40, we actually hear God speaking to Isaiah and telling him to speak to Jerusalem. And he actually tells Isaiah to cry out in verse 2. Cry out. And in fact the Hebrew there is cry out, speak tenderly to the heart of Jerusalem and cry out to her. So there's a lot of crying out going on in Isaiah 40. God is saying to Isaiah, cry out to her, that her punishment is over. And then this voice crying out in the wilderness. And then later on, this other voice when says to Isaiah, cry out. And he says, what shall I cry out? So there's a lot of crying out. And I think that's deliberate because the passage is evoking this sense of this is the day of proclamation. The day of proclamation has finally come. The day of this prophetic announcement has arrived, that God has got something new to say. This is a new prophetic period that we're entering. And that pretty much sums up everything that we're about to explore in the coming chapters. We are entering into this new, exciting, prophetic moment. There's something new in the prophetic pipeline that nobody has saw coming. It's completely hidden and completely secret. So what is this first voice saying? The first voice is saying, in fact, before we look at what it's saying, we should probably throw a little confusion into it to say that the punctuation, if you look at the chapter and you look at the verse, the punctuation is actually added. There is no punctuation originally in the Hebrew. There's no speech marks. There's no commas, full stops. There's not even any capital letters in the original Hebrew. So the speech marks in this passage are actually very confusing and a guess by the translators about where they should go. And we need to ask the question: does this verse we're looking at say, a voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare, or is it saying a voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare? It could mean either things, and maybe it's deliberately ambiguous, I don't know. But for what it's worth, I think it's probably saying, I probably agree with the NIV in the way it's translated it, it's a voice crying out in the wilderness, prepare. And of course you probably know this, but in the Eastern countries of this time, the kings of the East, what they would do when they were marching into new territories, they would send a messenger ahead, and that messenger's job was to prepare the way for the king and make sure that the king had a smooth path to get to his destination. And so there's this sense of this proclamation, this new period of proclamation is concerning the coming of a king, that a king is on his way, the king that has been prophesied, the king that has been spoken about in Isaiah 1 to 39, that the promise of God concerning the king has not been cancelled out. He is still on his way. The king is still coming, despite the desolation of the Babylonians. It goes on in verse 6. I just mentioned this. It says, a voice says, cry out. And Isaiah says, what shall I cry? And the voice replies, I think this is God speaking to Isaiah. But it says, a voice says, all people are like grass, and all their faithfulness is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fall, because the breath of the Lord, that's the breath of Yahweh, blows on them. Surely the people are grass, the grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of our God, the word of Elohim, endures forever. Isaiah 46 to 8. To get this is really interesting. What's the message of this first chapter, Isaiah 40, and I realise we're spending a long time on this first chapter, but the message of Isaiah 40 is this: your punishment is over. And although there's desolation and destruction, the king is still on his way. The king is coming. Get ready, proclaim, the king is coming. And that last little bit there, we always think of that as about the transience of human life when we read that, the people are like grass. But in fact, it's not so much about the transience of life, it's about the permanence of God's word. That God's promises and God's word have not and will not fail despite the fact of all that's happened. That his promises concerning the coming of the Messiah stand strong, and that his word will come to pass, just as he promised. So I think that's an exciting sort of like intro to this second prophetic period. And yeah, that's probably a good place just to have a little pause.